Good morning! So I just finished up chores and grabbed my second cup of coffee of the day, and I'm about to head out into the garden to do my weekly garden tour. Now, this particular garden tour is actually part of the collaboration with the Homesteaders of America. There are several channels that are participating, and there is a playlist that Amy from Homesteaders of America has been putting together of all of these wonderful garden tours, and I will link that down below so that you can find them. Be sure to check out these other channels. I know I personally have really been enjoying watching all of these tours and seeing how others grow things, what they're growing, and it's always a fun experience. I really enjoy it, so be sure to check out all of the rest of the channels. Now, I actually tried to film this tour last night. I prefer to film outdoors at dusk, but we got stormed out, so it's getting a little bit bright already, but I'm just going to go for it. And like I said, I do these garden tours every week all through the garden season. Now, if you are new here and you just happen to find this channel through this collaboration, very quick background. My name is Constance, and I'm a blogger at cosmopolitan.com. And my husband and I are empty nesters. We were an active duty Army family for 25 years. We lived everywhere from Alaska to Europe, and we have finally, 4 years ago, retired from active duty life and planted roots here in northern Alabama. Now, when we bought our property here, it was just some land, a house, and a shed barn, and that was it. So it has been a process and continues to be a process to build our homestead. And we named it a Good Life Farm because it is the good life that we have waited for a very long time. Now, I actually have two garden areas. I have an area directly here in front of my house that is a raised bed garden. It's gradually becoming a raised bed garden. I intend to add a couple new beds every year. Then I have an in-ground garden that is separate, that was a traditional tilled sort of garden, but we have been transitioning that into a no-till garden, and this is the first year that it is officially no-till. So I'm going to grab one more sip of my coffee and then we'll head out into the garden. So directly inside the gate, as soon as you come in on both sides, I just built these smaller little beds, and these are planted with some roses. Now, in the past, I've never been much of a rose person, but they've kind of grown on me the last few years, and my plan, these are climbing roses. Specifically, they are called Joseph's Coat roses, and they are a multicolored rose. You'll have all different colored roses all on the same rose bush, and I'm going to build an arch that will span across the gate, so as you walk in, you will walk through the arch, and eventually it will be covered with all of these roses. These were just built and planted within the last week. Now, my garden style is what's called potager style, in that I combine both edibles with beautiful things. So you have the aesthetics of flowers that are not only for my enjoyment, but they bring in the pollinators, the bees, the butterflies, and all of that. And then I also have herbs, and I have tomatoes and peppers and all of the fruits and vegetables that you would grow. So it's a combination of the things that are practical with the things that are beautiful. And it brings me joy, and I love doing it that way. And if a garden doesn't bring you joy, then why are you gardening? So in this first raised bed here, I have got sunflowers. I enjoy popping these in all over the place. They're cheerful, and I just love seeing them everywhere. I've got some salvia. I have several tomato plants that are here on this cattle panel trellis. And then there are several purple basil plants, and there is some purple kale down there. And then at the bottom of the arched trellis that I have here that connects to the other bed, I have planted Kajari melons. And this is the first year that I've planted these, so I'm really looking forward to giving these a try this year. Moving over here to this long bed, Now, I will say this long bed is my favorite garden bed in the garden, and I really want to make more exactly like this. I just love it. And I have several herbs. These herbs, like the broadleaf sage and the thyme, those are all things that overwintered, and I actually had to remove a lot of them because they grew very, very well. And so now that we have that established herb bed of these different things, I can just continue to enjoy them. Now on this side of the arched trellis, I have planted Luffa Gourd, and I grew Luffa out here last year. I loved the way it grew, and so I'm growing a few more of those this year. I have some tomato plants stuck in there on either side of that arch. Now that's not really the greatest place to put them because of those Luffa Gourds, but I had a lot of extra tomato plants. I had many seedlings and actually gave away quite a few, and so I figured I would just stick them in there rather than compost them all of the extras. And I know that the Luffa Gourd will probably try to suffocate those, but I just stuck them in there anyways. Now there are still several areas that look empty, but they have been seeded with flowers or herbs. I have some caraway put in there, I've got some straw flowers. So in those empty spaces, there's nothing to see yet, but there will be down the road. This particular plant is called Blue Monday Sage, and I did not actually plant that this year. It's self-seeded from last year and came back on its own. I love this flowering variety of sage, and I have it in several spots throughout the gardens. And not only do I have the Blue Monday Sage, but this year I also added Pink Sunday Sage, which looks just like this, except instead of this purpley blue color that you see, it is pink on top. Here we've got some Tulsi basil, I've got some zinnias, some cosmos. Now as these plants all grow and develop, I'll mulch all of this with straw to help with the keeping more consistent moisture in the soil. Right down there you can see some milkweed that has come up that I planted by seed just a few days ago. And then over here on this cattle panel trellis, I have more tomatoes. Now these varieties are the Dr. Weish, which is my favorite variety of tomato, I think. I grew those last year for the first time, loved them. I think my biggest tomato was 25 ounces, and it was a Dr. Weish tomato. I also have some Paul Robeson tomatoes. This is my first time growing this variety. I know it's a very popular one, and so we'll be giving those a try. I have some oregano, like the sage and thyme. This came back on its own. I actually harvested most of this a couple of weeks ago and dried it in my dehydrator, and as you can see, it has come right back. So I am going to have to come out here once again and remove a lot of this because it has just taken over this entire end of the garden bed. Now down in the soil around there, I've planted some more of that flowering sage. There's Blue Monday, there's Pink Sunday, there's also some yarrow tucked down in there, and so I will definitely be coming out here and taking back a little bit of that space from the oregano. Now over on the other side of the trellis, on this side, I've got, let's see, there's a tatsoi down in there. That is a brassica. And then of course there's lots of herbs. I've got some Genovese basil, there's some petunias, there's some sunflowers, there's some chicory, here is some cinnamon basil, and again lots of sunflowers. The sunflowers that are right in here are the Mongolian giant sunflowers, and I will be taking advantage of this trellis to help support them as they grow. Now the bed that you see over there, that wooden bed, that is almost all flowers. There is bee balm, there's some catnip, there's a couple varieties of dahlias, we've got some salvia, let's see, what else? Ismene, astilbe, anemone flowers, there's some lamb's ear, and a great big rosemary bush that I actually transplanted from a bed that I took apart. I wasn't sure if it would make it, but it actually seems to be doing well. It's got new growth, it's turning bright green, and so I think it's happy in its new location. Now this bed that you see here is a new addition. I just put it in a couple of weeks ago. The rocks were given to me by a friend, and then several of the blueberries that you see in here, those are all blueberries. Several of those actually came from a family here in my area. They contacted me through Instagram and said, hey, do you need any blueberries? Because they had an established blueberry grove on their property, and it had all of these baby plants that kept popping up. So they let me come and dig some up. A few of them look like they're gonna make it. Stuff like that really does not like being transplanted. But a couple of them look like they're gonna make it, so they're still in there. And then the two in the center, the larger ones, I had a couple that I had dug up and stuck in there, and they weren't making it. So I took those out and replaced those with a couple from a local nursery. And so this will hopefully become a nice blueberry hedge over here in the corner of the garden. Now as you look out across the property here, we planted all sorts of baby fruit trees. There are pears, there's apples, there's peaches. That concrete bed, that cinder block bed over there is an asparagus bed that we are working to get established. We just put that in last year. Beyond that, I just planted some goji berries, and so both inside the fence and outside the fence, we've got all sorts of berries and fruits, and eventually I hope this becomes a food forest kind of area. Now these two beds right here are some of the first beds I ever built for raised beds here on the property, and they have served their purpose, but when I built them I did not use treated lumber. I used plain old pine, and while the one closest is looking okay, it is definitely the last year it'll be getting used. The further one, I actually don't even know if it will make it through this year. It is just disintegrating. So these, either way, these are the last year that these will be getting used. The one closest to me has mostly flowers in it. We've got snapdragons and columbine, there's some chicory in there, we've got some dahlias, there's zinnias and cosmos that actually self-seeded from last year and came back on their own. There's some more of that flowering sage, and then there's a nice established bee balm patch that I've had to actually thin out several times. And I have an arched trellis that is connecting those two beds, and on either side I have planted cucumbers. This side I have national cucumbers, and on the other side I planted a few Ashleys. Now those were just planted, and so I don't have anything coming up yet. And then over there in the blue totes, there's two of them over there. I just stuck some potatoes in there that were growing in my pantry. It might actually be too late in the year in Alabama to be growing potatoes. But I put them right there along the bee balm because it gets shaded from the afternoon sun, and so maybe it'll give them a little bit of a better chance. I don't know that I'll get anything out of them, but the potatoes were wanting to grow in the pantry, so I figured why not? I have the totes, I have some straw and soil, and we'll just see what happens. Now this last bed over here, the one that is in really rough shape, this has all sorts of pepper plants. There's some lettuce that reseeded itself from last year. And then over in the empty area, now originally I planted some poppies in there. None of them came up, but I have learned a trick for growing poppies, which I will try this coming year and see if we can't get some to grow. That's one of the things I have struggled with over the years is poppies. So I went ahead and I put in some Aunt Molly's ground cherries and a few other things. I've got some Thai basil tucked in there, and there's several things that are just kind of coming back on their own. As they come up, again, I will mulch around there. The pepper plants I put in and mulched around them. They're doing okay, but they're struggling a bit. Every year when you garden, there is going to be some sort of challenge that you are faced with and that you have to overcome, whether it is too much rain or not enough rain or a pest infestation. Last year our struggle was cucumber beetles and Mexican bean beetles. We had a super mild winter and those things came on early and hard, and this year's winter was even milder. It was almost non-existent. So I fully expect to have issues with those, but our winter was also extremely wet, and because of that we are now dealing with a lot of slugs and snails. They are all over our property, and so I am going to have to come out here and put some slug traps out here and try and deal with these. Those pepper plants are just getting demolished by slugs because that particular garden bed is the worst of them all in this entire garden as far as slugs go. So with that, this is the front garden, the raised bed garden area, and fruit trees and all of that. So now let's head on over to the in-ground no-till garden. Alright, so this is my no-till garden. I do have a couple of raised beds in here, but I don't plan on building any more raised beds. It'll just be the in-ground no-till beds. And these beds have been a progress and continue to be a progress to bring life to the in-ground soil, because our farm, our homestead, was built on old farmland, and that soil was dead, depleted, and lifeless. And I mean, you couldn't even find earthworms in it. And so this has been a progression, and every year we're seeing more and more improvement. So in the first long bed here, I have this cattle panel trellis, and at the bottom of it I have planted purple pod pole beans. So they will climb up the trellis, and this is a new variety that we planted this year. So far they seem to be doing pretty well. Over on the other side of the trellis you can see some plants over there. There's lots of flowers and herbs. There's purslane, there's zinnias, there's yarrow, cosmos, there's some herbs like cinnamon basil. I've got this beautiful lemon queen sunflower that actually self-seeded from last year. And then here I have another grouping of tomato plants. These are all different kinds of tomato plants. Now this year's garden is going to be a little bit of an adventure because I had a mishap. There's some hodgepodge of things. My tomatoes, my seedlings got all mixed up, so I don't know what varieties I've got planted where out here. There's a couple places where I do know what they are, but then the rest of them all got mixed up, and so I won't know what tomatoes are which until they start producing, because thankfully all of the varieties that I planted look different from one another once they fruit. So at that point I'll be able to tell them apart. The vast majority of my seeds came from Baker Creek. I also use M.I. Gardner and a couple other places. I really like to focus on using heirlooms. And as far as how I fertilize and pest control, I really do everything as naturally and safely as possible. I really like to focus on organic methods, because down the road we do plan on adding bees here, and I figure why not learn those techniques now, so that not only will my bees be safe, but then all of the natural bees and all the natural pollinators that come here anyways will also be safe. So that's how I do things. In several places in my garden, both the front garden, the raised bed garden, and this garden, I have patches of comfrey, and this one is actually about to get harvested and used. I use it generally for fertilizing my garden. Here I have some more tomatoes. Now that patch over there is all holy basil, Tulsi basil, with the exception of a purple opal you can see. This all came back on its own, self-seeded. So once you plant Tulsi basil, very good chance you're going to have it year after year. Down here I have some butternut squash and a couple nasturtiums here and there. Now this area down here I seeded with a variety of different kinds of flowers. Once they begin coming up, then I will come in and I will mulch this area. I may actually have to reseed a lot of this. We had an incredibly late freeze this year, and I think that several things that I planted in the ground seed-wise had germinated and then froze. So I may end up having to replant that if I don't see anything showing up soon. Down here in this bed, I have, again, several things that came back on their own. For instance, those are all pepper plants. And this was either the Tabasco pepper plants or it was lipstick peppers. I will thin most of those out and just leave a couple of them to grow on their own and just see what comes up. Now, one of the things that we did this year was we installed drip line watering system, and it is wonderful. I love it. I wish we'd have done it a long time ago. It takes a lot of the time constraints out of my mornings, and down the road I plan on adding it to the raised bed garden as well. So over there along the first row I planted Roselle flowers. Then the second one here is chamomile, and I'm so incredibly excited to actually see chamomile coming up. That is one of the things I have tried to grow many times, and I've never gotten anything to happen. And so for the first time I've actually got chamomile, and I'm really excited. Here I have, along this next row, I've got several onions. I planted a whole bunch of them. They were starts from a local nursery, and most of them honestly were not looking great. So the ones that were just toast, I pulled them out. But there were a few that looked like they were trying, so I left them, and we might actually get some onions. And then down here where I had pulled out most of the onions that didn't survive, I've planted a bunch of Daikon radishes. Daikon radishes we grow for a couple of reasons, but namely they're actually really delicious when you roast them. So I just threw those in there. So now we come to one of my arched trellises. And this particular trellis, I planted Chinese noodle beans. We grew those last year, absolutely love them. Not only were they delicious, but they were beautiful, climbing up these arches and these gorgeous red beans hanging down. It was beautiful. Now to the side of the trellis, I have lots of perennial flowers. We've got the comfrey, we've got blanket flowers, there's cone flowers, there's some dahlias, there's also some purslane tossed in there. And like I said, I like to have a lot of flowers mixed in with all of the other things that I'm growing. This is a patch of peppers. I have 10 varieties of peppers that I'm growing, and this is one of each of them. Some of them are doing great, some of them not so great. And I do see a little bit of pest damage, so I will have to come out here and start taking care of this. Here again we have another section of perennial flowers. We've got some daisies, some guara, some stonecrop, and at the bottom of this trellis I just planted some French green beans that are a climbing variety. Now all of these zinnias that you see coming up here are volunteers from last year. They are just prolific. And some of them I removed, some of them I left them where they are. I have a bunch of space right there in the middle that I haven't planted anything yet. So there are areas of the garden that aren't yet established or decided upon. Now along this trellis, this is another variety of climbing green beans. This is the NT Half Runner. We grew those last year, absolutely love them. And so we're growing them again this year. Down there, on the other side, I've got things like dwarf oregano, I've got some marjoram, and things like that. And then on this side, I've got a couple sunflowers and some sage plants, some flowering sage that are coming up. There's, again, a few zinnias, but then all through here, this is again one of those hodgepodge things, and it's kind of like a let's just see what happens situation. All of these little plants are either okra or roselle, or it could be a mix of both. I'm kind of leaning towards the okra. But here's the thing, I didn't actually plant any of them. So last year in that area I planted both roselle and okra. They were kind of side by side one another, and they both grew really well. The thing is, all of those came back from those plants. They all self-seeded. And because roselle and okra are related to one another, they're both in the hibiscus family, their seedlings look almost identical. I think most of those, if not all of them, are probably okra, but we will just have to wait and see. I figured they wanted to grow, why not use those free plants? So once they get bigger, we'll have a better idea of what they are, and I figured, why not? And then this bed again is peppers. It's one of every kind of pepper that I'm growing this year. We've got a sweet Lesia pepper, a Myra pepper, a Chinese 5-color, pepperoncini, bell peppers. Then we've got jalapeno, some Elma paprikas, cubanelles, jigsaw, and a Luschauer paprika pepper. So that is the garden tour for this week. Things are coming along, they're starting to grow, you're starting to see things develop and come together. There's lots of things that have not yet been planted. There's some areas that will get filled in as we go. And then of course there's spots where I had put in seeds and none of those have made an appearance quite yet. So I look forward to seeing how the garden grows this year. Last year was a fantastic garden season. Even though we struggled early on because of such a mild winter, you know, we had pests that we had to deal with really early in the year. And despite that, it ended up being a wonderful garden and brought me a lot of joy. So again, if you are new here, I do a garden tour every week throughout the garden season. And in addition to the garden tours, I do at least 3 videos a week on homesteading, home cooking, and back to basics. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I also have a newsletter that you can sign up for that gives you a weekly digest of everything that is new on Cosmopolitan Cornbread, both on the YouTube channel and on my website, cosmopolitancornbread.com, where I've got hundreds of recipes and articles, homesteading, chicken care, gardening, you name it, you can find it there. So thanks for coming along on the garden tour with me. Again, my name is Constance from Cosmopolitan Cornbread, and I'll talk to y'all next time.